April 1973. Federal Express had exactly $5,000 left in its operating account, and Monday morning was coming fast. Fred Smith knew what that meant. Payroll was due. Fuel bills were stacking up. Creditors were circling. The company had been bleeding cash for months, burning through investor money like jet fuel at 30,000 feet, which was ironic, because there were barely enough jets in the air to justify the metaphor. The employees didn't know how bad it was. The board didn't have a solution. The banks had already said no. So Fred Smith did what any rational, desperate, Ivy League-educated founder would do in the spring of 1973. He bought a plane ticket to Las Vegas. The question isn't whether he was crazy. The question is whether crazy was the only option left. Federal Express was born from a Yale economics paper that Fred Smith's professor famously graded a C. Smith had written the paper in 1965, sketching out a radical idea, a centralized hub-and-spoke air freight system that would guarantee overnight delivery anywhere in America. The professor found the concept impractical. Smith found it inevitable. He came from money. His father, James Frederick Smith, had co-founded the Dixie Greyhound bus line and died when Fred was just 4 years old, leaving behind a small fortune in trust. Smith served 2 tours in Vietnam, flew combat missions, learned to study systems under pressure. He came home with discipline, ambition, and a very specific obsession about how packages moved, or rather, how badly they moved. In 1971, he incorporated Federal Express Corporation in Little Rock, Arkansas. He poured in roughly $8 million of inherited money and raised $24 million more from venture investors including New Court Securities. That was serious money for a startup in 1971. It should have been enough. It wasn't. The plan required planes, pilots, ground crews, sorting facilities, and a fleet of vans, all of it standing by, every night, whether 3 packages moved or 300. The infrastructure costs were monstrous and fixed. Revenue was supposed to catch up. It didn't. By early 1973, Federal Express was losing over $1 million a month. The original launch in March 1973 moved only 186 packages across 25 cities on the first night, a number so low that some executives reportedly laughed, because crying felt too honest. The venture investors were growing cold. General Dynamics had been courted as a potential backer and walked away. The banks had reviewed the numbers and politely declined to review them again. The fuel crisis triggered by the OPEC embargo was making everything worse, driving up the cost of every flight. The company had burned through roughly $27 million and had almost nothing to show for it operationally. By late April of 1973, there was $5,000 in the account. And then came the decision that changed everything. It was a Thursday. The exact date is not nailed down in every account, but what is consistent across every version of this story, from Smith's own telling to multiple journalist investigations, is the sequence of events, the desperation behind them, and the specific, almost absurd outcome. Smith had just returned from what may have been his most humiliating trip of the year. He had flown to Chicago to make a final appeal to General Dynamics for a $30 million capital infusion. General Dynamics ran the numbers, looked at the operational data, and said no. Firmly. The company was functionally out of road. Payroll for hundreds of employees was due Monday. The operating account held approximately $5,000. The minimum needed to make payroll and cover the immediate fuel obligations was somewhere around $24,000. The gap was not a rounding error. The gap was the whole ballgame. Smith did not call an emergency board meeting. He did not draft an urgent memo to investors. He did not seek an emergency line of credit from a regional bank. Instead, by multiple accounts, including Smith's own, given in interviews over the decades, he took the $5,000 and flew to Las Vegas. He sat down at a blackjack table. Now here is where you have to slow down and really sit with what this moment meant. This was not a man throwing away money he didn't care about. This was a man who had poured his entire inheritance into this company. He had recruited people, real people, with mortgages and families, who believed in him. He had spent 2 years building something from pure will. And he was sitting in a casino in Nevada with his company's last $5,000, betting on cards, because the alternative was watching everything end on a Monday morning anyway. The amount he won has been reported slightly differently across sources, but the number Smith himself has cited is roughly $27,000. He flew back. Monday came. Payroll was met. The pilots got paid. The ground crews clocked out without knowing how close it had been. The mechanics who had been maintaining those Falcon 20 jets didn't know that their employer had funded their wages from a blackjack table 48 hours earlier. The company kept flying. Smith later described the decision with characteristic bluntness. He said, in essence, that the money wasn't going to save the company anyway, that it wasn't enough to matter strategically, so he might as well try to turn it into something that could buy another few days, another few conversations, another chance. That is not the logic of a gambler. That is the logic of a man who understood odds and had decided that 27-0 was a better bet than 5,000-0. And he was right. The blackjack win bought time. It did not buy salvation. That part came harder. In the weeks that followed April 1973, Smith threw himself into finding real capital with the kind of desperation that only a man who has already lost most of his dignity can muster. He pursued investors aggressively and managed to close a $32 million capital raise by the end of 1973, a remarkable achievement given how close the company had come to complete collapse. General Atlantic and other institutional investors eventually came in. The money stabilized the operation and allowed Federal Express to scale towards something that could actually work. But the human cost of those early years was significant and largely invisible to the public. Employees who had joined Federal Express on the promise of Smith's vision had worked through months of financial chaos without knowing the full picture. Some had deferred raises. Some had taken informal pay cuts. The executives closest to the crisis carried the weight of knowing how near the edge they were while managing people who didn't. That kind of sustained concealment, even when justified, leaves marks. Smith himself was sued by members of his own family. His 2 sisters filed a lawsuit alleging that he had misused trust fund money, the inherited capital he had poured into Federal Express, and that he had done so without proper authorization. The lawsuit was settled, but not before it became public and added another layer of chaos to an already turbulent founding story. There were also allegations around that period that Smith had falsified a letter to obtain financing, a charge that led to a criminal fraud case. Smith was ultimately acquitted, but the trial itself, which came later in 1975, exposed just how much improvisation had gone into keeping this company alive. The unexpected consequence, the one that almost no one talks about, is what the near-death experience did to Federal Express's culture. The company that emerged from those early crises was not a comfortable organization. It was forged in a particular kind of fire, and it developed a tolerance for risk, for aggressive decision-making, and for the belief that execution under pressure was the only thing that actually mattered. That culture made FedEx great. It also made FedEx, at times, ruthless. The people who left during those first 2 years, who couldn't hold on, who saw the chaos and made rational decisions to find stability elsewhere, they never got to see what their labor helped build. What Fred Smith did in April of 1973 was irrational by every conventional measure. He violated every principle of responsible stewardship. He took money that belonged, in some moral sense, to his employees' families and put it on a table in Nevada. And yet, the story has survived 50 years not because it's a lesson in gambling, but because it reveals something fundamental about the difference between calculated risk and paralysis. Smith didn't go to Vegas because he thought blackjack was a sound financing strategy. He went because he had correctly identified that the $5,000 in that account was already insufficient. It could not save the company. It could only delay the same death by a few days. So the real question he was answering was not, should I gamble? The real question was, what is the actual value of doing nothing? And he answered it. Business schools spend enormous energy teaching frameworks for decision-making, models, matrices, risk-adjusted returns. What they rarely teach is what to do when all the models have already failed. When the spreadsheet shows 0 on every line. When the rational path and the desperate path have collapsed into the same path. In those moments, the only thing that separates a founder from a failure is the willingness to keep moving when movement itself seems absurd. Federal Express went public in 1978. By the mid-1980s it was generating over $3 billion in annual revenue. Today FedEx Corporation moves approximately 16 million packages every single day. None of it happens without Monday's payroll. None of it happens without that blackjack table. And none of it happens without a man who understood, at the bottom of everything, that the most dangerous bet you can make is the one you're too afraid to place.